power output is an internally driven concept. So I want to talk about an element, and especially in therapy, this doesn't get talked about very much at all, although it's very, very important, is power. So when you look at our performance-related spectrum, we've got the absorb force, produce force, right? And so those elements, while they include acceleration, the time constraint tends to be less important. So if you look at a power lifter as the example, when they're talking about producing force, they don't really have a time constraint other than what it would take for them to get past a certain point in the range of motion, because if they don't get there soon enough, then they tend to turn around, they go the other way, and they miss a lift. But the next phase after absorb force, produce force is produce power, which does have a time constraint. And this is a missing element in a lot of things because people overemphasize whatever the term strength means, and I think they tend to associate with force production, which is fine if that's what you want to do. I think it's just a very big term when they say, oh, you need more strength. When a lot of times when there is a time constraint, it's either ignored or they're unaware that they need it. So even in like a situation where you're rehabilitating someone that would be diagnosed with a pelvic floor issue, they have a time constraint in regards to their ability to transition from position to position, where the pelvic diaphragm has to be active at a certain rate, or they fail whatever they're trying to do, whether it be a squat or whether it be trying to control urine flow or whatever it may be. So think about laughing or jumping up and down. There's a time constraint there, and if my pelvic diaphragm doesn't do what it's supposed to within that time constraint, then you make a wet spot, and so that can be embarrassing and uncomfortable and things, and they don't like that. And so we always want to think about this, but it also lends us a viewpoint that makes us aware of the fact that when we're talking about power output under any circumstance, whether we're talking about a sprinter, a jumper, a basketball player, or a woman that's rehabilitating her pelvic diaphragm, power output is an internally driven concept. They always look at extremity forces and time constraints, but the reality is that if you don't have management of your internal forces, you don't have much power output, and you'll see certain physical structures in people that are always accused of not having speed or quickness. Their physics just don't allow them those internal forces to be managed in such a way that allows them to move quickly or overcome gravity. Right? Now, if we're going to talk about the internal forces, we're going to talk a lot about the pelvic diaphragm and how it influences the movement of the guts, especially up and down, because that's the direction that gravity tends to work when we're upright. And so we need to bring up some concepts that we use from a terminology standpoint and clarify those, because the way that we perform an activity in the gym will be very, very specific in regard to what position of the pelvic diaphragm that we're talking about, and then what the pelvic diaphragm is doing, whether it is producing force against something or trying to dampen and control force. And so we want to talk about a change in terminology in regards to what is traditionally referred to muscle contraction, which is horribly confusing if you ask me, because it just doesn't make sense. And so typically when we talk about contractions, there's three types. There's concentric, eccentric, and isometric. And isometric doesn't exist, so we're just going to take that one off the table. It just does not exist, right? Static positions exist, but the muscle activity in those static positions is variable at every moment, and therefore we have lengthening and shortening of sarcomeres and myofibrils and fasciculi, et cetera, et cetera. So they're constantly changing, and so that's not asymmetric. So let's just take it off. We can call it statics if we want to, and that's very useful because we use statics all the time. But now let's go to the concentric and eccentric concepts. So concentric is traditionally a shortening of the muscle from whatever it would be, whether it be a resting length or some imaginary middle point. And I'm okay with that because that makes sense. So concentric is the shortening element, contraction is shortening. That's really, really cool. But if you tell me that there's such a thing as an eccentric contraction, now I have an issue with that because now we have an oxymoron. So this is like the jumbo shrimp thing that we were talking about before, is that So eccentric is movement away from the midline, which is a lengthening orientation, a lengthened orientation of the muscle. Contraction is shortening. So what eccentric contraction means is lengthening, shortening, which makes absolutely no sense to me, right? But I think that if we start to look at the muscles as a moment in time, we can start to identify them as orientation. So orientation refers to position. So we can say that a muscle is eccentrically oriented at a moment in time or concentrically oriented at a moment in time. But we still have to appreciate the influence of the tension that's produced by contractile tissue. But I think that the easiest way to do that is to determine what direction the movement is occurring within that contractile tissue as it's producing tension. So now we have a muscle that is moving beyond its midline, so away from its midline. So it's eccentric. But if it's moving away from the midline, then it would be yielding. It would be giving way. So this would be like lowering a weight in a biceps curl, or having a weight that's so heavy that I can't resist it and I'm yielding. So one would be intentional and one would be unintentional, but yet the premise is the same. So I'm yielding. So we could say that a muscle is eccentrically oriented and yielding, or concentrically oriented and yielding. In opposition to that, we could say that I have a contraction or a muscle that's producing tension in an overcoming fashion. So that would be a muscle that's actually shortening its length by producing tension against whatever it may be pulling against. So now I have a overcoming contraction, and I can produce that from a yielded or from an eccentric position or a concentric position. And I think those are just much better descriptors. So if we were to draw this out, we can use if we were to draw this out, we could just use a little grid here, and I could say I have concentric yield, I could have concentric overcome, and I could have eccentric yield, and I have eccentric overcome. Now the cool thing about looking at it from this perspective is that I have a way that I can influence each four of those outcomes using a different exercise or modifying an exercise as to where I'm applying a force or where I am influencing the performance of that activity with a cue. And so we could take an activity like we were talking about the kettlebell drop clean a little bit ago. So depending on where I catch the load, and I could do this with a barbell clean as well. So the difference between a power clean and a pull clean is actually the position of the pelvic diaphragm and then how much yielding I'm allowing. So the deeper I go into a squat, the more eccentric orientation I need to get the depth. So the eccentric orientation allows range of motion to occur, but I still have to dampen the force as I catch the load. So I need eccentric yielding at the bottom. To stand back up, I need eccentric overcoming to move the weight in the other direction. If I did a power clean, however, if I caught it high, that means that I've got a concentrically oriented pelvic diaphragm, but I still need to dampen the load. So I'm yielding in a concentric orientation of the pelvic diaphragm if I'm catching in a power clean. And then as I push upward to stand from that catch, I need to overcome from a concentric orientation. So simply by using one little exercise, I can capture all four of these representations. So I have two orientations, and then I have two ways that I'm producing tension. So this is actually really cool because I can identify these with range of motion too. I can take my table test or I can take some of my gym tests and I can identify what these specific needs are. I could take a performance related test like a box jump or a drop jump, and I can identify what my athlete's needs might be, and then that targets my exercise selection based on these four elements.
I did have a question about time constraints and the internal effects of those time constraints.
Right.
So is it more so that the internal physics, so say the physics of the guts and that nature, that's what's determining whatever time constraint? As far as if it takes longer for my guts to move, I have a longer time constraint and I need to shorten that, and then vice versa?
Absolutely. So let's use a powerlifter as an example for that, because it's a really, really good representation. So a powerlifter wants to stay as concentrically oriented as possible and as overcoming as possible. Because even if I'm concentrically oriented, if I yield too far, I'll go past a point that I cannot control, and then I become too yielded, or I accidentally become eccentric, and I will move in the direction of the eccentric. So let's use the pelvic diaphragm as an example. So as a power lifter, I need high force, right? High pressure strategy. So I'm concentrically oriented in the pelvic diaphragm. Always, always, always pushing up. But I need to yield enough to get depth, right? Now, because I don't have a time constraint, I don't need a tremendous amount of yielding, nor do I need to be very, very quick about it, right? Like I said, there's an element of the smallest little constraint there where I make the turnaround, because if I don't make the turnaround effectively, it'll just keep on going. But in general, because I don't have the same time constraint as, say, like a jump to get off the ground, I don't need the capacity to make the quick change with the guts. Now, because of that as well, they're not going to leave the ground when they do try to jump. Now, there's exceptions to the rule. Of course, you'll always find occasionally the powerlifter that can, do the high box jumps and things like that, right? But that tends to be a little bit more of a favorable structure versus a training effect, right? But in general, because they don't have the time constraint, they just need to produce a high enough internal pressure. They don't have to do it as quickly as, say, a field athlete or an offensive lineman or a linebacker or somebody that we would picture as being a similar physical size but has to move quickly.